My name is Tom Boyatt. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I went through almost all of the ranks, from vice consul to career minister, and I served in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, and mostly in Latin America. The story I'm about to tell concerns my efforts to get back to my post. I'd been on home leave, and I was going back to Nicosia, Cyprus. I got on a TWA aircraft at Dulles, and the route it was flying was Washington to Paris to Rome to Athens, where I was going to get off and go down to Nicosia, my post, where I was political counselor, and its ultimate destination was Tel Aviv. I was sitting happily on the airplane between Rome and Athens at about 30,000 feet. I know these things because I was in the Strategic Air Command, and the 707 is the functional equivalent of a B-47. So I had a pretty good idea of how much gas, how much fuel they had and the characteristics of the plane and so on. Anyway, we were at 30,000 feet, and at 30,000 feet, the ground looks like a map. There's water here and land here, and I know that geography pretty well. And we were just coming over Greece and the Corinthian Canal. And I thought, wait a minute, we should be at about 5,000 feet, not 30,000 feet. What the hell is going on? And at just that moment, a voice came on the loudspeaker and said, "We are the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. We have seized this aircraft. It is now PFLP flight number 1. We've done this because there are Israeli assassins aboard. We're going to go to a friendly country, and your just demands will be heard when we get on the ground." And so, to put this in context, there'd never been a skyjacking in the Middle East. There'd been a couple in Cuba, but none in the Middle East. I thought that what would happen was that we would go to Beirut, they would land in Beirut, have a press conference, state their cause, and everybody would be home for dinner. But it didn't turn out that way. What happened in the event was, and I remember flying past Cyprus, and we came over the Middle East coastline, and I thought, good. And we were coming down. We're going to land in Beirut, and I've scoped this out pretty well. At that point, as we got, my guess is about 10,000 feet, boom, we had Star of David fighter planes on each wing that I could see. We also had one in back and one in front that I could not see. And then I thought, uh-oh, there really is an important Israeli on this flight, and they're going to take us out rather than let him fall into the hands of the PFLP. That was the first time that I really felt fear. What they were really doing was flying around over Tel Aviv, hurling insults at the Israelis. Colorful Middle Eastern insults like the lack of any difference between the armpit of a camel and your mother's hair, that sort of thing. Anyway, they turned north, and the two fighter planes broke off. And then I was pretty sure that we were either going to Damascus or to Baghdad, and probably Damascus because it was closer. We flew, and the sun was crossing and beginning to set, and I knew we were about out of fuel, and we started down. And the hijackers who'd had us like this for several hours came back on and said, "We are soon to land in a friendly country. We're going to blow this plane up 60 seconds after you get on the ground. So we urge all passengers to evacuate immediately." And they kept repeating this as we're coming down. They collected, the cabin crew collected everybody's pencils, shoes, watches, anything that would, when you impact in an aircraft going that fast, everything that's not tied down keeps going with the speed of the aircraft as you hit. And so they took everything, particularly our shoes, balled that all up in plastic bags and stuck it in the johns. So we came down, bounced once, bounced again, and then skidded off the runway. At that point, to be perfectly honest, men had taken over the doors from the French ladies who were the cabin crew. And I don't know why that happened, but that just happened. And I was at the port door in the rear. And I opened it, and everything worked as it should. And people started going down the chutes. And my job was self-appointed, was to make sure nobody froze at the door, because we had to get out fast. And so everybody was out in my little world. And then I went down, and I discovered that we had landed in a field of prickly pears. And people were without their shoes. And we had, you couldn't stop and worry about it. You had to run and get away from that aircraft. Well, it was chaos. People were screaming and falling down, and I'm picking them up and telling them to, move, get out of here, go, go. And we got about, my guess is 100 yards from the aircraft, and there was a slit trench. It turned out it was part of their airport defense. We tumbled into the slit trench and looked up over the sandbags, and there were 3 passengers under the port wing, 2 of them on the ground. One of them really hurt, thrashing, And so I got up, and I stood up, and I'm looking at this, and I looked around, and nobody was doing anything. I thought that the crew would have been trained to go get them, but nothing was happening. I turned to my left, and there was an American soldier there. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he knew I was an officer. If you've been in the military, you will understand that. Enlisted always know when an officer's around, whether he's in uniform or doesn't matter. And he looked at me, and I looked at him, and he knew that I was going to ask him to do something he'd just as soon not do. And he looks at me, and he says, "Oh, shit, sir." Here I am in the middle of the desert, bleeding feet, and I'm laughing because it was really funny. And I said, "Come on, let's go." So we ran back. The lady on the ground had a double compound fracture of her left leg, both bones through the skin, and she's thrashing around. And so she was a real problem. There was another one hurt, but he just had a sprain. So we made a fireman's seat and got her into that fireman's seat. There was no, carrying her over the shoulder kind of thing with that kind of an injury. So, and the guy that had the sprain leaned on one of us, and his wife, who stayed with him, helped him on the other side. So the 5 of us went back, and just as we got to the trench, it blew. That was just like the movies. There was a puff of white. The first thing you saw was visual, a puff of white smoke with an orange ball in the center. And then we heard the sound and felt the whomp, and then we saw hot metal dropping all around. But we were out, it was dropping between us and the aircraft. And eventually they came and picked us up, and I'm thinking about this the whole time. And I realized that this plane is full of Jews going to Tel Aviv from the US and Canada, but other nationalities as well, mostly Americans. So what do you do in a situation like that? And I'm thinking about that, and they came and got us in a bus and took us to an empty hangar, and we're all standing around. And I'm deciding, it took me a while to get there, but I decided that the best defense is an offense. And so I had my black diplomatic passport in my pocket. I walked up to the man that was clearly in charge, and I said to him in French, "I'm an American diplomat. This is an American flag plane. And I want you to understand that everybody on that plane is under the protection of the United States, and that I'm generally, given these circumstances, in charge of this situation. And this guy rushed off to the phone. And he was clearly going up his chain of command. And he came back to me and he said, we understand your position, Monsieur le Secrétaire, but you must understand our position. You have invaded our country. And I said, what do you mean invaded? We didn't invade you. Your Palestinian friends invaded you. They control the plane. We're not here by choice. And he said, nevertheless, you are here, which was a very good point. We were there. And he said to me, he said, we have to go through our normal procedures, which means we interview everybody involved. And then we will make an assessment of the situation and try what to do, try to figure out what to do. And I said, well, in those circumstances, and given my official position, I need to be present at all of these interviews. And of course, the purpose of that was to prevent rough stuff. And so back to the phone, and he came back to me and he said, that is acceptable. And at that point, I thought I knew that the Syrians really weren't looking for trouble, that this hadn't been planned, it didn't appear, between the Syrians and the PFLP, and that they were trying to find a sort of procedural way out. In any case, I knew it was going to take a long time to interview everybody, and that meanwhile, our friends back in the Near East Bureau would be working to get us out of there. And the longer it went on, the harder it would be for it to have other than a reasonable ending. So for 2 days, and we took one break at night and 2 days of interrogations, this is all going on. And at about early in the afternoon of the second day, maybe later, maybe a little bit later, they came to me and they said, your government is represented here by the Italians, and there have been negotiations between your government and my government, and the Italians are sending an all-Italia aircraft to take all of you back to Athens. And I said, that's everybody, right? Because, you know, we're talking about Jewish people from all over the world, including several Jewish Americans. And he said, yes, everybody but the Israelis. At that point, I knew that there were 2 Israeli men, 2 women, and a child, just 5 Israelis. The good news was that they were proceeding on the basis of nationality, and the bad news was that they were keeping the Israelis. And so I said, that won't do, Colonel. It's everybody or nobody, or we all stay. Back to the phone. And he came back and he said, listen, Mr. Secretary, there's a limit to our patience in this matter. And I said, well, Colonel, of those 5 Israelis, 2 are women and 1 is a child. And I know that you don't make war on women and children, correct? Correct. He said, but the 2 Israeli men are of military age. This war that we were engaged in is not over. There's merely an armistice. So we have the legal right to keep them, and we are keeping them. And that's our final offer. And I said, it's a deal. And so all of us, save the 2 Israeli males, were put on the All-Italia flight, and we flew to Athens. The 2 Israelis were traded for a Syrian fighter pilot who'd gone down in the 6-day war. So at the end of the day, it was no dead, 2 or 3 wounded, 1 badly, and no prisoners, nobody left behind. So, you know, you always talk about lessons learned. And for me, the main lesson was, first of all, I was right. The best defense is a good offense, because then you define the terms of the discussion. The second thing is, since this was the first such event in history, There was no State Department bureaucracy. There were no standard operating procedures, no policy statements, no detailed instructions on what to do. And I could just go with the flow and let my instincts do the job. And essentially, I was as far as I knew, I was negotiating with the Syrian government at some level through this colonel. And clearly they were negotiating with Uncle Sam through the Italians. And I think the third lesson is that if you stay in the Foreign Service long enough, you're probably going to have a very serious adventure of this nature. Look at all of our colleagues in the adventures they had in Vietnam, adventures in the Middle East, adventures here, adventures there. It's a risky profession, but it's a wonderful way to live, if you live.